So this is and this is true in many areas. They got into many areas of our culture, and they redefined a lot of things. They redefined the notion of what social justice is. They redefined the purpose of education. They redefined the notions of freedom. And these are intertwined into our culture. And so when you have a political debate, some of these premises are automatically in people's minds, and they start arguing. And so you have to go back and re-examine these premises, and in order to move forward and start talking about moving, we want to have more freedom, we want to have more justice, we want to have a better education system. Well, what do we mean by these terms? Because these terms have been redefined. So we need to go back and take a look at these things if we're going to pursue those objectives. And they're worthy objectives. I have no problem with these objectives. I have a problem with the way they have been redefined from the original understanding, but I have no problem with the objectives themselves. Now, there is a big difference between the view that sees this gap that we talked about earlier as being breached or solved through a relationship with God, or through social engineering. If you believe that this gap and this perfection is to be created by social engineering of the best, but on the part of the best and brightest, then the idea of a transcendent God is a messy notion that gets in the way of efficiently socially engineering society. And this is exactly Dewey's view. There was a piece that he wrote called The Price of Liberty. And obviously he's redefining what liberty means. And this one says, there is no God and there is no soul, hence no need for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes. The price of liberty. The price of liberty is to get rid of our old superstitions. Why? Because if you believe in fixed absolutes and you believe in God and you believe all these other things, then you're probably going to try to impose your values on others. And this understanding is one of the reasons why I've heard people come up to me today and, people might agree with us on this specific issue, but they're afraid to death of the religious right because they're going to impose their values on us. But if you believe in absolute truth, then obviously you are a threat to the harmony of a pluralistic society where tolerance is a virtue, because you're going to want to impose your values on others. Interesting viewpoint, because it's actually just the opposite. In addition to the Judeo-Christian worldview, which talks about justice coming from a transcendent creator, and we referred to this earlier, you have the Greek Greco-Roman view, and the starting with Socrates. And I want to talk about this. In Plato's Republic, there's a dialogue where he talks about Socrates. He's having a discussion with a group. There was this group of traveling intellectuals called the Sophists. And one of their leaders was a gentleman by the name of Thrasymachus. And he had an argument with Socrates over the nature of justice. The Sophists, this is where our word sophistry or sophisticated come from. They were these traveling intellectuals that considered themselves sophisticated and obviously engaged in sophistry. They had visited all of these little Greek city-states, and they had seen, each one of them had their own notion of justice or truth or whatever. So they come to the conclusion that truth is relative. You have your truth. Sound familiar? He has his truth. You have your truth. Who's to say what's right? It's all relative to your point of view. It's like the Declaration of Independence, Constitution. That's a product of the British social political system of the 18th century. It's not relevant to today. These are views that are being ingrained in people as necessary for pluralism. But what did Thrasymachus come as a conclusion of such? He held these views. So what was the conclusion? If there's no standard of justice, then justice is the advantage of the stronger. Or might makes right. The logical conclusion of holding no standard, no transcendent standard of absolute justice is not pluralism. It's not tolerance, because tolerance is a virtue. Who is to say you are to be tolerant? The logical standard is justice is the advantage of the stronger. If you're stronger than someone now, you have the right to impose your view of justice. Why not? There is no standard of justice. During the Middle Ages, or actually during the Renaissance period, Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, he made this argument that Christian leaders cannot follow Christian moral values if they want to be effective, because you have to be ruthless to impose your will on others. Nietzsche was talking about this notion that God is dead, and that the result of this is going to be a blurring of the distinction between man and animals. And as these views start to gain currency, you're going to have wars one against another, because in the law of nature, the law of the jungle, kill or be killed, survival of the fittest. So if there's no distinction, no moral distinction between man and animals, why don't we act like animals? So he predicted the coming of wars like we have never seen, as one group would raise up against another group, and then eventually you would have the emergence of the Superman, who would impose his moral views upon the others. He would, and he saw this as a good thing, and this is exactly what Hitler tried to put into play. Hitler was a student of Nietzsche's thinking, and so were a lot of the intellectuals who surrounded Hitler. So the notion that moral relativism is a threat to freedom, and is the notion that moral relativism is a prerequisite of freedom, and that the belief in absolute truth is a threat to freedom, is absolutely the opposite. And that history has shown that it is the viewpoint that truth is relative that leads to tyranny. And so this is an argument that the other thing, the rejection of the natural law tradition, is kind of ironic that one of the excuses given by the progressives for rejecting the natural law tradition is because they're pointing to the imperfection of American society, and one of those imperfections obviously was slavery. Well, the abolitionist movement, that was one of the greatest moral crusades in human history, based its whole argument on natural law philosophy. And their opponents, the slave owners, rejected the natural law philosophy because they had the intellectual honesty to recognize that it undermined their arguments for slavery. So you have the progressives coming along later, pointing to the problem of society, but making the same argument vis-a-vis the natural law tradition as the slave owners did. So you got these, cognitive dissonance is a term for holding two contradictory ideas at the same time. You're going to have moral relevance, but you're going to have justice and freedom. You're going to reject the natural law tradition, but you're under the guise of that things like slavery are not a good thing. You want to get rid of them. It doesn't make sense. So this notion that the Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview and its view in its vision of God is something that is detrimental to the social engineering utopian view that is coming about. It's not something new that Dewey dreamed up. It's been around for a while. One of the godfathers of modern day liberalism is Jacques Rousseau. And he wrote this piece called The Social Contract. And he's looking back. He was a big fan of the ancient pre-Christian pagan society in Europe, where you did not have this messy individualism or this separation of powers. And I want to quickly, this is right out of his work, The Social Contract. Several peoples, however, even in Europe and in his neighborhood, have desired without success to preserve or restore the old system. By old system, he's referring to the pagan worldview. But the spirit of Christianity has everywhere prevailed. That's a problem. The sacred cult has always remained or again become independent of the sovereign, and there has been no necessary link between it and the body of the state. Muhammad held these very same views and linked his political system well together, and as long as the form of his government continued under the caliph who succeeded him, that government indeed was one, and so far so good.